Hi everybody, it's Crazy, it's Friday, and it's time for my new video series. Now before I get started, as I do with all my video series, I gotta give a shout out to my trusted, cause you guys rock, to my crazy fam, love you guys, and to my patrons, thank you for your support. Now, I'm going to go a little bit different route than I did with my learned experience. I'm actually going to read from the book instead of just going over highlights of what I did and how I accomplished what I accomplished and yada yada yada, because a lot of times it's harder to explain something unless you're going through it. So what I'm going to do with this one is I am actually going from a book, but before I get started and before we get going too far, it's all going to be about the Blender game engine. Okay, that's the BGE. Now the BGE was a really good, I think was a really good game engine, but Blender decided to take it out, and some of the people in the community thought that was kind of unfair, and they were wanting to fix the original BGE, and so they came up with UPBGE. Now, believe it or not, UPBGE is built on Blender. Okay, it's basically in the API. They put it in there, so you don't have to import or export. Now, before I get going too far, okay, just stand by for just a moment. Okay, I'm going to be working from 0.2.0. Okay, and let me see if I can get out the way. There you go. 0.2.x is the one I'm going to be using right now, but later on in time I'm planning on going to the 0.3 version. But right now I want to get some of the old basis down, and I want to learn it, so as I'm learning it, I'm going to drag y'all along with me. So, with that being said, I believe it's... yeah, there we go. Blender, changed up their entire UI and decided to go a completely different direction than the original old Blender, because after 2.79 they stopped making the old style and went to the newer style, which is actually really good, and I'm not complaining about that. So you can get the latest download from right here, download the latest Blender, or you do not have to have Blender in order to run UPBGE. UPBGE stands alone on its own. Now these guys have literally went leaps and bounds and have been pushing it and making the UPBGE way more than a lot of people expected. As you can see just in the little video they have right there, look at the style, look at that, look at the view of it, how you can actually make it work. And you can actually do games. You build games right there in UPBGE, which uses the Blender platform, and they've actually progressed it to you can actually use it in the 3.0 version of Blender. Okay, so you're no longer stuck at 2.7, okay, 2.79. You can actually go up to the 3.0 version of Blender because of the fact that they actually been working on that and trying to get it going. They released 0.3.0, which I've been talking about for a while now, and they released it at the same time that Blender released its 3.0 version. So, all that's being said, you can do so much with it. So, jump on over there, go to their downloads, download it right here, 0.3.0, 64-bit if you have a 64-bit system. For Windows, they also have it for Windows 7. I'm on Windows 10, and you can actually use it with Windows 11. Okay, go figure that, right? These guys have been working really hard on getting UPBGE up there. Now, some people call it UPBGE. I call it UPBGE because it's the upgraded version of BGE, in my opinion. So when I say UPBGE, I'm not downing, the project itself. I am actually giving it a thumbs up. Saying UPBGE because it's the upgraded version to me. All right. With that, I'll be going into that once I get done with this small series I'm going to be doing on just a standard BGE. And that's this one right here, which is actually 0.2.0 is the one I'm working on. It's based off of 2.78.5. The only reason why I'm using 2.0 is because I was working with it doing a project called the Blender Wars. Okay, and I got back into the habit of old 2.7 and loved it and got a little bit off key when I was trying to do my Python learning as well. So it was kind of hard for me to get back into it, so I figured I'd start from a familiar place, which is actually the 2.7 version of Blender, which also is 0.2.0. Now, they do have the an upgraded version from the 2.0 version. It's actually 2.5, I think it's B. I think it's up to 2.2.5B. 0.2.5B or something like that. But anyway, it's basically based on the old Blender, and they built it up a little bit more. They still had some issues with it, and they were working most of them out, and I do believe they did. But for this one, I'm just going to use 0.2.0 because I know it was a stable release. It was one of the better releases, in my opinion, and a lot of the people I know's opinion. So I am playing with it, and that's what I'm going to use from this, because the book I'm using, and let me bring it up here. Let me switch back over to here. There we go. The Complete Game Development with Blender book. Okay, and you can actually find this on the UPBGE documents page. I will put a link in the description so that way y'all can go there if you want to follow along with me. This is one of the older books. It's an older book, but it's been updated a little bit to try to help with a lot of the newer features that were in 2.79. And some of the stuff that they talk about, isn't in some of the later version. This is based off of 2.6, I think it is. And so they were going forward with it. So basically, I'm going to be reading from this, and I'm going to go from there. That's how this series is going to go. And I will dance between this screen and this screen in order to show you what I'm talking about. And guess what you don't get to see? You ain't got to look at my ugly mug today. So, since you don't have to look at my ugly mug, it's not that big of a deal. But if you must have me in there, I'm always just a click away. But I figured this would be a little bit easier for me to do, so that way I can, when I'm over here and I'm working in Blender, you don't have somebody's face like right in here distracting the crap out of you, and to me that always annoyed me. I get people want to put their face out there, but when you're trying to show something, it's kind of harder to do. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to leave this one up, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit. The complete game development with Blender book was made by, and I hope I say this right, Dali Filinto and Mike Pan. Okay, and basically they made this book so that people can learn Blender, learn how to use the BGE, and they give all kinds of insights, and I think it's great, and so I'm going to follow along with it. So as I begin reading, it says, this is a replication of the book originally published by Cengage. Okay, we put the book up here for free, hoping to allow more people to learn the Blender game engine. We also hope to continue to improve the book with the help of the community and keep it always up to date. So there's different chapters. There's chapter 1 is getting started with Blender. Chapter 2 is your first game. Chapter 3 is logic bricks. Chapter 4 is animation. Chapter 5, so on and so forth, as you go down through the chapters. Now, if you'd like to, wanted to contribute back then, I don't know if you can still contribute to it now. They do have a GitHub that you can go to. You can look it up on. I'll probably put the link in the description as well. But since this book was written years ago, as they point out, Blender has gone through many, many improvements. So there will be omissions and errors. Please help us keep the book up to date by submitting a pull request on GitHub. Okay, the license is also a Creative Commons license. So, that being said, and credits go to these guys right here. I want to actually switch over so you can see these guys, because all these guys are very, very important, because they actually took the time to build this and just book up and give it to people. Alright, so, and of course, you. Okay, because without you, nobody would be able to see these books. Okay, so, with that being said, they got all the information and stuff, and they go on to it. So that was the end of the first chapter. Let me minimize that for a second. Bear with me. Okay, getting started. Now, I'm doing the getting started part. It's actually the very beginning of it. Okay, basically chapter 1, getting started, and then it talks about the origin story. Okay, how Blender begins, the Dark Nights, and the Blender rises. Okay, so we're going to scroll down. It says, okay, chapter 1, getting started. Here's something you don't know about Mike. He has read more Linux books than he cares to admit. Unfortunately, Mike rarely makes it past chapter 2, given that the first 2 chapters usually contain nothing more than a warm introduction and a history of the software. This practice has 2 profound consequences. The first is that Mike can articulate the history of Linux far better than most anyone. The second is that he still does not know how to actually use Linux. Granted, the former happens to be far more useful at the party than knowing the difference between tar, CVFZ, and LSHOWs. I have no idea because I'm not a big-time Linux fan. In keeping with this tech book tradition, this book won't be any different. In this chapter, you will learn Blender's rich history and be introduced to the various basics of this application. Okay, so the origin story, it was the mid-1990s, and the personal computer was taking off faster than anyone had anticipated. I would know. I was there. Yes, I was there. With it, there arose an advent of animated graphics in 3D games. Most of the games that started coming up had a lot of good graphics, and most people nowadays would consider them as to be pixelated. Okay, so Blender begins. It was at this time, this ripe time, that Blender came into being. Blender started off as an in-house 3D animation software created by a small Dutch animation studio called Neo Geo. And if y'all remember also the good old Neo Geo machine that came out, yes, part of the same group. Perhaps it was because of a lack of a cheap and compatible substitute. Perhaps it was due to sheer ambition. Neo Geo decided to create its own animation software from scratch rather than using what was available, which wasn't really that much back then. You really had to, do your own. The chief programmer of Blender was Ton Rosendahl, who was responsible for writing a large part of the core Blender functionalities. So everybody knows who Ton is, and yeah, we need to say more, right? For the next few years, Blender remained an internal tool of a very successful animation studio. The software became so good that in 1998, Blender was made available to the public. A new company, not a number, NAN, okay, was formed to oversee the development and distribution of Blender. Largely via the internet, Blender was distributed as 2 separate versions. A free version with limited functionality, and a version that was not free called Blender Publisher. Now, if anybody remembers that, then you've been in Blender for quite a while. Okay, that had a few features, or a few additional features. Being the only complete 3D animation and game creation package available for free at the time when the computer graphics was still in its infancy, and I do mean infancy. It was, we had, small pixel graphics, and if you ever played with Python, and if you go back and see some of my other videos, my learned experience videos, you'll see that pixelation is pretty big time, and that was back in the day as well. Blender started gaining popularity, and many online communities developed that allowed artists to share knowledge and their work. Dark Nights. Alas, with the collapse of the internet bubble and some other unfortunate circumstances, Not a Number, NAN, filed for bankruptcy in 2002. Since Blender was an integral property of the company at the time, dissolving the company meant an uncertain future for Blender. The Blender community did not want to see their favorite software go down with NAN. So, a deal was struck in which NAN would release the source code of Blender to the public for a payment of 10,000 euros. A Free the Blender fundraising campaign was started. The online community responded very generously. A few months later, enough money was collected to convince NAN to re-release Blender as an open source software to the newly established Blender Foundation. The foundation was created specifically to manage the now open source Blender. Tom Rosenthal, the original creator of Blender, heads the foundation, and y'all have seen him many a times get on there and talk. Blender Rises. Located in beautiful Amsterdam, the Blender Foundation now oversees the development, distribution, and marketing of Blender. But because of the open source nature of the software, its development has been driven largely by volunteer contributors from across the world. The Blender Foundation also created the Blender Institute, an animation and game studio that focuses on movie and game development using Blender. The Institute produced the movies Elephant's Dream, Big Buck Bunny, Sintel, Tears of Steel, Cosmos Laundromat, and the game Yo Frankie. Now, a lot of people who when I was in the community, actually got to see Big Buck Bunny and got to play Yo Frankie. Okay, and it was fun. I enjoyed every minute of it, and that was some of the best times when I actually experienced Blender. Okay, now these projects serve two main goals. The production process is an opportunity to improve Blender in a real studio environment, and the end result also serves as an advertisement for the software itself. Then came Blender 2.5, which changed much of how Blender looked and behaved. This refactoring, as it was called, took years of planning and coding. Blender 2.5 marks a significant milestone in the history of Blender. For users coming from the Blender 2.4X series, the entire interface looks radically different. Menu items are rearranged, keyboard shortcuts are altered, and even the default color scheme had changed from the boring gray to a slightly less boring shade of gray. Blender 2.5 is designed to be more intuitive, faster to use, and easier to learn than its predecessor. Now, I'm going to actually touch base on that too, because a lot of the 2.4 people didn't want to change to 2.5 because it was a complete change. Now, as you see in this version of UPBGE and /Blender, okay, this style was actually the style that I got used to from get-go. This is what I learned from. So I wasn't part of the 2.4 genre. And I was used to the 2.5, 2.6, 2.7, and grew as it grew. And I seen some of the things being added in, some of the things being removed, a bunch of buttons being added in. And now that it's changed over to 3.0, okay, it's actually 2.9 or 2.8 that they went to, and then 2.9, and now 3.0. You know, they changed the whole UI up in 2.8. When they went to 2.8, they changed up the whole UI. Basically, the same thing. It says over here, the Blender design, you know, it was intuitive, faster, and had, you know, it was easier to learn than its predecessor, which in actually the 3.0 version, or 2.8, was actually easier to pick up, and a lot of people were picking it up and doing animations and movies and stuff like that. But they took out the game engine. That's where the problem lied. Okay, but they did this. They went from 2x, basically went from 2.7 or 2.79, okay, series. The entire interface looks radically different. That's 3.0, 2.8. Okay, menu items are rearranged, keyboard shortcuts are altered. Same thing happened. Even the default color scheme had changed from the boring gray to a slightly less shade of gray. Yeah, they kind of changed it up too, where it's actually a darker shade of gray. But it does outdo its predecessor because of the fact that there's a lot more featureability. There's a lot more things you can do in Blender now. And same thing with UPBGE, since it went from the 2.x version to the 0.3x version. Okay, so keep that in mind as we go through this. I really wanted to point on this because that's one of the things that's important. It's very important because a lot of people don't realize how things changed back then or how they change now. So stick in there. It doesn't get that bad. It's actually better. Alright, so Blender uses the Python programming language for scripting. With Python, you can customize the behavior of Blender, extend its functionality, and more importantly, control the game engine. Knowing how to program is not a requirement for using Blender, but knowing Python will make you a far more capable game maker. And that's one reason why I was doing my learned experience, because I was learning more on the Blender aspect of things. Okay? Alright, the year, let's see, let me take me a quick drink here, sorry guys. Reading a lot does make you thirsty. Alright, so the year 2012 marked the 10th anniversary of Blender going open source. During these 10 years of open source development, more than 150 people have contributed something to the source code, totaling 50,000 contributions, commits in SVN techno jargon, basically in commits, if you know anything about that. Averaging nearly 30 commits every day over the past year. Needless to say, the program has improved much over the years, and it shows no sign of slowing down, which it hasn't. The image below, okay, which I'm going to bring up here right now, this image right here, okay, shows the Blender development statistics gathered from the official SVN repository, including Blender trunk all, I don't know why it says trunk, Blender trunk all its branches. Okay, that's some jargon I don't know, but if you know that jargon, give me an explanation in a thing, because I didn't quite understand that. Okay, and it says, of course, software exists to serve the users. That's you. Every time a Blender user creates a piece of artwork, it justifies, even if just a little, the enormous amount of time that went into creating the software. We hope that by picking up this book, you are on your way to creating something amazing to share with the world. Now, I picked up the book because I found out about it because I was on the UPBGE server, which will also be in the description below. Let me go ahead and put my lovely face back on here. Okay, so it'll be in the description below. But I used to play with Blender. I was into the games, trying to figure out how to do them. I'd made basic little startup games. It's those ones that you start and never finish. My advice to you would be, if you were getting into this for the first time, try to do some Python learning first and then come into the Blender game engine, because it'll actually help you out. But you don't really have to have Python knowledge in order to be able to use the UPBGE engine. Okay, you can actually do it without it. You can do it with logic bricks, and chapter 3 in this book shows, how each logic brick works, which I'm going through right now. I just wanted to get some basis on the beginnings of Blender, because a lot of people really don't know how Blender started or how Blender became, and this book tells a lot about it and gives basically most of the information that you would actually ever need to know about Blender. Okay, so I'm going to continue on and see how this goes, right? Okay, so another about Blender. Chances are you already know that Blender is an open source 3D software that is capable of modeling, animating, rendering, compositing, and producing a game all in one package. Even if you are not sure what each of those terms means, don't fret. Let's break it down. Let's break down the term open source 3D animation software. Open source means that the Blender source code is available for anyone to access and modify. The most obvious advantage to open source software is that as an artist, you can use Blender for free for non-commercial as well as commercial work. As a developer, you are allowed to modify Blender in any way you want to suit your specific needs. But open source does not mean that anyone can make malicious changes to the Blender code without approval. Blender is licensed under the GNU Public License version 2, GPL2. In a nutshell, it means that Blender can be copied, modified, and if reshared, the changes in the source code have to be available and licensed in the equivalent license. So it has to be licensed in the GPL2, license. Okay, Kavat. Before you publish a game using Blender, you should understand the limitations of the GPL. Sorry about that. People like to call me. Before you publish a game using Blender, you should understand that the limitations of the GPL. This topic is covered in Chapter 9, Publishing and Beyond. The term 3D means that 3 dimensions. Of course, I'm not going to go into that one deeply because if you're using Blender now or you're thinking about using Blender, you know what 3D is. You know that people were going into 3D. So I'm not going to really go too far into it. And I'm also running out of time. So, mainly I'm focusing on the Blender game engine. So about the game engine, Blender is a multifaceted tool. This book will focus on one aspect of it, the game creation process. If you are new to Blender, learning the game engine means you will pick up basic modeling, animation, and other necessary skills along the way. If you already have Blender experience, great. The skills you already know will take transitioning to the game engine much easier. Transitioning to the game engine much easier. Compared to some of the commercial game engines available today, the Blender game engine, the BGE or the GE for short, is relatively simple. Is that a bad thing? Not necessarily. A simple platform like Blender is very easy to learn, and yet it's flexible enough to do a lot. Okay, and now when it's talking about BGE, now we're going to be talking about a BGE because, as you know, the BGE was taken out of Blender after 2.79b. Okay, so if you still have regular 2.79b or earlier, you can still use the Blender game engine as it was then. UPBGE stepped in and started fixing the problems with Blender. Now, I stated that at the very beginning of my video. If not, rewind a little bit and you'll see. Okay, the future of UPBGE. Now, here's where it goes into it. Okay, one downside of to writing about software is that it's continually or constantly improving. Even today, projects such as UPBGE is promising to dramatically improve the features and functionalities of the Blender game engine. Okay, so they actually started, working, trying to fix some of the problems with the game engine because it was so lacking with all the, like cycles and stuff like that that were coming out and that were working really well, but wouldn't work well with the engine. So UPBGE stepped in there and said, hey, we're going to try to do this. Okay, and it was actually one of the reasons why I'm in UPBGE and not any other ones, because UPBGE still gave me that focus of Blender, or the old BGE. Okay, so it says, we will try our best to keep this ebook as up-to-date as possible. What you should do as a reader is to make sure you are always using the latest version of Blender. Okay, if the latest version is not good enough, you can find the official daily build on builder.blender.org. additionally, many non-official test builds of Blender are available from graphical.org. Okay, so and also there's also test builds of UPBGE that you can get from the UPBGE web page, or you can actually go on to the UPBGE Discord server. And a lot of the guys have refixed some stuff that hasn't been implemented yet. You can actually try out and see if you like it, so on and so forth. Okay, 3D basics, we already know about the 3D basics, so I'm going to kind of skip through that, and that's about where I'm going to end for today, because for the most part, I've got to keep the video short, and this I think kind of ran kind of long, but I'll go into more of that next week, and I'll start to get into chapter 2. So if y'all think this is an okay video and you think it would work this way, let me know. If not, I might change it up a little bit and try to make it like a tutorial or something like that. But I don't know if I'm going to do tutorials, because I don't think I'm that good of a teacher, and I barely know it myself. So tell me what y'all think, and see, let me go back over. No, that one. There we go. Go back over to this one. Let me know what you think in the comments, or hop on over to my server. I actually have. See, where's it going there? I updated it right there to. I used to have it in red, and had all kinds of things going on with it, but I have all my information down there so you can see it, and hopefully you can come on over to the server and say hi, how things going. Let me know your thoughts. Check out some of my older videos. Become a patron and check out my Oops videos, which I do every other Friday. This Friday I do BGE. Next Friday I do Oops. So if you'd like to get in on that and find out what my favorite project is going to be and how I'm going to implement it and some of the concept ideas I've got, become a patron. Okay? So till next week, we'll see you then.